So why are you wearing that uniform here?
I'm active duty. I'm on leave.
People don't just walk around dressed like that.
It's authorized. Here's my ID.
That doesn't look real. Where'd you get this?
You can call it in. It'll verify.
Step over here and...
The encounter took place at a gas station just off a major highway, late afternoon during a routine stop for fuel. The Marine had pulled in on his way to visit family while on approved leave. He was wearing his service uniform, which is permitted under military regulations while traveling. There was nothing unusual about his behavior. He paid inside, returned to his vehicle, and began pumping gas. The officer arrived after a brief call from a nearby business reporting a man in uniform causing concern. The call did not allege a crime, it described uncertainty. Department policy allows officers to make contact in such cases, ask questions, and verify information if needed. It does not allow detention without cause. From the beginning, the officer framed the interaction around doubt. The uniform was treated as suspicious rather than ordinary. The Marine's presence was questioned not because of his actions, but because of an assumption that he did not belong there. When the Marine presented his military identification, it should have prompted a verification step. Instead, the officer dismissed it without checking. This decision mattered. Verification is a routine process. A simple radio call or database check can confirm active duty status within minutes. It removes uncertainty and ends the encounter. In this case, verification was delayed. The officer continued questioning while maintaining control of the interaction, asking the Marine to remain where he was and not leave. The Marine complied. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He explained, more than once, how the officer could confirm his identity. The officer did not follow those instructions. Instead, he repeated the same questions in different ways, circling back to the assumption that the uniform was not legitimate. The gas station remained active around them. Cars came and went. A clerk watched briefly through the window, then returned to work. No one intervened. The situation remained quiet and contained, but it was no longer routine. The Marine was no longer just answering questions. He was being treated as someone who might be committing a serious offense. At this point, body camera footage captured everything. The camera did not show chaos or confrontation. It showed a slow narrowing of options caused by disbelief. Each unanswered verification request increased the pressure. Each repeated question made it harder to reset the interaction. The officer's authority allowed him to control time. By asking the Marine to wait, to stand in place, to explain again, the encounter extended beyond what policy intended. The Marine was not told he was under arrest. He was not told he was free to leave. The ambiguity became the mechanism of control. What neither man knew at that moment was how quickly this interaction would move beyond the gas station. A call placed during the encounter reached a supervisor. Another call, made later, reached military command. Once the Marines unit was notified, the situation entered a different jurisdictional space. Within hours, the event would be reviewed not as a misunderstanding, but as a potential civil rights violation involving a service member. Federal statutes apply when military personnel are unlawfully detained by local authorities. Those statutes carry severe penalties, especially when actions are recorded and show willful disregard for verification. What began as a call about suspicious behavior was already on a path toward formal investigation. The officer believed he was maintaining control. In reality, the decision to ignore the ID and delay verification had created a record that could not be undone. The Marine had been in service for more than a decade. He enlisted shortly after high school and completed basic training without incident. Over the years, he moved steadily through the ranks. His record showed consistent evaluations, no disciplinary actions, and multiple deployments overseas. Supervisors described him as reliable and methodical. He was known for following procedure closely and avoiding unnecessary attention. At the time of the incident, he was assigned to a stateside unit with administrative and training responsibilities. His current role involved mentoring junior service members and overseeing compliance with operational standards. Wearing the uniform outside of base was not unusual for him. Travel between duty stations, leave periods, and family visits often required it. Military regulations allow this, provided the uniform is worn correctly. He followed those rules carefully. Colleagues later noted that he preferred to keep interactions simple when in uniform. He avoided political discussion, did not socialize in public spaces, and rarely stayed long in one place. Gas stations, rest stops, and grocery stores were routine parts of travel. He had experienced questions before, mostly casual comments or requests for photos. On one prior occasion, a store employee asked if the uniform was for a promotion. He corrected the assumption politely and moved on. The interaction ended without issue. The officer had been with the department for several years. He was not new to patrol work. His training records showed standard performance and completion of required courses, including procedural justice and bias awareness. He had received average evaluations, with supervisors noting confidence in field decisions and a tendency to rely on personal judgment. There were no prior terminations or criminal findings on his record at the time. In the months leading up to the incident, the department had circulated internal reminders about verifying credentials rather than relying on visual assessment alone. These reminders followed unrelated complaints involving mistaken identity. The officer acknowledged receipt of those notices, as required, along with other routine policy updates. There was no indication he viewed them as unusual or urgent. On the day of the incident, the officer was working a standard shift. Nothing in the call log indicated elevated risk. The report that brought him to the gas station was vague and did not allege a specific crime. It fell into a category officers encounter frequently: requests to check something out. How officers handle these calls depends heavily on discretion and adherence to procedural verification. Both men entered the encounter carrying expectations shaped by their roles. The Marine expected a brief conversation, followed by verification if needed. That had been his experience in past interactions with authority. The officer expected to assess and resolve a potential issue quickly. His approach relied on visual cues and personal assessment before formal checks. Neither man anticipated escalation. There was no prior history between them. No external pressure forced immediate action. The situation did not involve a crowd, a disturbance, or an emergency. It unfolded in daylight in a familiar public setting under routine conditions. What mattered was not intent, but process. The Marine's background reflected strict adherence to rules and chain of command. The officer's background reflected trust in discretion and control of encounters. When those approaches met, the outcome depended on whether procedure would override assumption. By the time they stood facing each other at the gas station, those differing professional habits were already in place. The Marine waited for verification. The officer delayed it. Neither adjusted quickly enough to prevent what followed. The Marine had just finished pumping gas and returned to the driver's side door. The officer stepped forward, not blocking him, but maintaining proximity. "Can I ask why you're in uniform?" the officer said. The Marine replied, "I'm on leave, traveling between bases." He reached slowly into his wallet to show his military ID. The officer held his hand up. "I'll need to see that, but don't move yet." The Marine complied, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. A car pulled into the next pump. Its driver glanced toward the interaction, but did not pause. The station clerk continued scanning items inside. Urban background noise, tires, engines, a radio playing in a parked vehicle was present but did not dominate. No one intervened. The officer asked where he was coming from and where he was headed. The Marine answered succinctly: leave route, family visit, expected return to duty. The officer's tone remained steady, questioning but not raised. There was a subtle pause after each answer as the officer considered the Marine's responses. At one point, the Marine reached to adjust the ID for better visibility. The officer interpreted the motion as nervous or evasive, though it was simply to hold the ID closer to the camera. The officer requested the Marine's full name, date of birth, and service branch again. Each request was calm but firm. The Marine repeated the information. The officer repeated the initial concern, asking how he obtained the uniform, phrasing it as a matter-of-fact inquiry rather than accusation. The Marine suggested that verification could be made by phone or radio, citing his unit's contact line. The officer paused, glanced toward his patrol car, and shook his head slightly. No action was taken to call or confirm at that moment. The Marine's repeated offers to provide contact information were ignored. A brief misunderstanding occurred when the Marine shifted to place the ID in his wallet. The officer asked to leave it visible. The Marine froze briefly, aware that the officer was not accepting explanation without verification. The gesture, a routine movement, was enough to increase the officer's suspicion. Minutes passed. The Marine remained compliant, answering questions without altering his voice. The officer kept a measured pace, circling back to the uniform and his authority over the interaction. No force was used, no arrest was declared. The tension grew quietly, contained in the stillness of mutual observation and unverified identification. By the end of this initial phase, both men were aware that the interaction had exceeded ordinary questioning. The Marine knew his compliance was not being recognized as sufficient. The officer knew he had yet to confirm what he assumed was a potential impersonation. The encounter, while calm, set the stage for escalation. The slow accumulation of assumptions, the repeated questions, and the delay in verification created pressure points. Small movements, factual statements, and routine gestures became signals in a confined space, turning a routine stop into a procedural standoff. The officer leaned slightly toward the Marine, repeating, "I still need to know where you got that uniform." The Marine held his hands visible and replied calmly, "It's issued by my unit. You can verify it with them right now." He provided the direct line for his commanding office. The officer hesitated, then asked, "Why would they give you this if you weren't supposed to be here?" The Marine repeated that he was on approved leave and explained how verification worked. He offered his full identification details again. The officer nodded, then continued questioning, circling back to the same concerns without making a call. A bystander at the next pump glanced toward the interaction, noticing the Marine standing still and the officer maintaining control. The clerk inside the store observed briefly but returned to scanning items. No one intervened. The interaction remained quiet. The officer asked for documentation beyond the ID, a printed leave form or official travel orders. The Marine stated he did not carry those documents but offered the supervisor's contact for immediate confirmation. The officer paused, considering, then repeated, "Stay right here while I check this out." At one point, the Marine shifted his stance, adjusting his posture to respond to a minor question. The officer interpreted the movement as reluctance or avoidance. He instructed the Marine to remain exactly where he was. The Marine froze, raising his hands slightly to show he was unarmed and cooperative. Minutes passed in a pattern: question, clarification, repetition, pause. Each answer from the Marine was precise and calm, yet each request for verification was postponed. The officer's tone stayed measured, but disbelief was evident in the way he kept returning to the uniform and ID. A subtle moment of fear occurred when the Marine realized the interaction could escalate without resolution. He had no indication that the officer would call the unit for confirmation unless prompted. The Marine remained compliant, but internally recognized that authority was questioning him without verifying facts. The officer continued to frame questions around the assumption that the Marine's uniform was illegitimate. The Marine responded with the same factual clarifications. The tension rose not from force or noise, but from repeated dismissal and controlled questioning. By the end of this phase, the Marine had provided all verifiable information he could. He remained professional and still. The officer maintained control, enforcing the interaction through position, questioning, and refusal to verify. The standoff was complete in its calmness. No bystanders reacted, no physical restraint was applied, and no vocal escalation occurred. Yet the misunderstanding had compounded. What had begun as a brief verification request had now entered a prolonged period of subtle pressure, setting the stage for the intervention that would follow. After several minutes, the officer's radio crackled. A supervisor had been contacted following the ongoing delay. The supervisor arrived at the gas station, walking toward the patrol car and the Marine without urgency. No raised voices, no gestures of alarm. The Marine remained in place, holding his ID in plain view. The supervisor asked the officer to summarize the situation. The officer recounted the Marine's presence, the uniform, and the repeated ID checks. The Marine quietly provided the same verification information he had offered from the start. The supervisor nodded and made a brief phone call to the Marine's unit. Through the line, the unit confirmed the Marine's identity, his approved leave, and the legitimacy of his uniform. The supervisor glanced at the officer, expression neutral but focused. "It checks out," he said. The officer's posture shifted slightly. He paused as if processing the confirmation. The Marine was not asked to move or demonstrate further. The supervisor simply relayed the confirmation. The officer stood quietly, holding the ID a final time before nodding. No dramatic reaction occurred. No reprimand was delivered on the spot. The moment was procedural and factual. The atmosphere adjusted subtly. The tension that had been built by repeated questioning eased. The supervisor instructed the officer to end the encounter and allowed the Marine to leave. The Marine complied, returning to his vehicle calmly. He did not speak further. The officer made a note in his report, acknowledging that verification had been completed by the chain of command. He did not express public apology, but his body language indicated a recognition of the oversight. He stepped back, allowing the Marine space to exit. Witnesses, the bystander and the clerk, continued to observe quietly. No interventions were needed. The supervisor's presence and the verification completed the procedural resolution. The Marine was free to continue his travel without further interference. Although the encounter ended peacefully, the recorded interaction had already created a traceable record. The Marine's unit noted the details. Federal oversight would later review the footage. The officer now faced documentation of the misjudgment, not just the verification outcome. The correction was complete, quiet, and factual. There was no dramatization or confrontation beyond the procedural reality. Yet the consequences of ignoring verification would ripple outward, ultimately triggering review, investigation, and legal scrutiny that could not be undone at that moment. Following the gas station incident, the Marine filed a formal complaint with both his unit and local authorities. The report detailed the officer's repeated refusal to verify his identification and the extended questioning despite compliance. The complaint was supported by the body camera footage which captured each step of the interaction in detail. The officer's department initiated an internal review. Supervisors examined training records, prior evaluations, and relevant departmental policies. Standard procedures required a detailed analysis of the officer's decision-making, including whether verification protocols had been followed. The review also assessed any potential civil rights implications arising from detaining an active duty service member without cause. Military leadership was notified. Because the Marine was on active duty, the Department of Defense took interest in the interaction. Military authorities reviewed the same body camera footage alongside the officer's report. They confirmed that the Marine's identity and status were accurate. The review noted that federal statutes apply whenever local authorities unlawfully detain active duty personnel, creating potential legal consequences. As the investigation proceeded, the officer was placed on administrative leave pending findings. The department explored disciplinary options, including retraining, suspension, or termination. The review highlighted the officer's reliance on assumptions rather than policy, and how ignoring verification procedures escalated a routine stop into a matter involving federal oversight. Legal counsel for the Marine and his unit assessed whether civil or criminal action was appropriate. The interaction's documented timeline and the clear refusal to follow verification procedures created a foundation for federal review. Potential charges could include misconduct or obstruction of federal verification protocols. Media outlets, once aware of the incident, reported the encounter factually, focusing on the unusual scenario of a uniformed Marine being questioned and the subsequent Pentagon involvement. Coverage noted that video evidence was critical to understanding what occurred. Public interest rose due to the combination of military service, civil authority, and procedural failure. The officer faced mounting scrutiny. Internal reviews suggested that dismissal was likely, and federal oversight could introduce long-term legal consequences. Policy revisions were considered, emphasizing immediate verification of military personnel when questioned, clear guidelines for documentation, and steps to prevent misjudgment from escalating in similar circumstances. By the end of the process, the Marine remained on leave without further incident, but the officer's career trajectory had been significantly altered. Suspension and formal charges, combined with procedural lapses, indicated the severity of the consequences resulting from a single misjudgment during what should have been a routine encounter. The encounter highlights how assumptions can escalate ordinary interactions. In this case, visual cues, the Marine's uniform, led the officer to question legitimacy without following verification procedures. Both parties acted within their professional frameworks, yet the lack of immediate confirmation created tension and risk. Bias, even subtle or unconscious, can influence decision-making. Officers rely on observation and experience, but when assumptions override formal verification, the consequences can extend beyond the individual interaction. Here, a routine stop became a matter of federal oversight because protocol was not followed. The situation demonstrates the importance of system checks. Verification procedures exist to prevent misjudgments and protect both authority figures and those they encounter. When procedures are ignored, it exposes organizations to legal scrutiny, public criticism, and internal disruption. This case also underscores how structured processes reduce ambiguity. Clear steps for identification, reporting, and verification help maintain order while minimizing misinterpretation. Relying on personal judgment alone, especially in public interactions, increases the potential for error. The Marine complied throughout, showing how professionalism and procedure intersect. The officer, meanwhile, followed his own perception of control but delayed necessary verification. Both actions were rooted in real-world behaviors, yet only adherence to formal steps could prevent escalation. Ultimately, the lesson is systemic rather than personal. Policies, training, and accountability mechanisms exist to prevent mistakes from becoming critical incidents. Understanding how authority, procedure, and human assumptions interact helps organizations refine practices and avoid repeating similar situations. What do you think of this encounter?
Have you ever witnessed a situation where authority misjudged someone despite clear evidence? We'd like to hear your perspective in the comments. Sharing your experiences can help others understand how assumptions and procedural lapses affect real-world interactions. How could verification or clearer communication have changed the outcome in this case? If you found this breakdown insightful, consider following the channel for more documented real-world cases. Each story examines events as they happened, focusing on facts, procedure, and the lessons systems provide. Your observations and reflections help create a space where discussions about authority, accountability, and professional interactions remain calm, grounded, and informative.